Today's Struggle for Democracy program, our goal is to help you understand how people's struggles across the globe are contending with the rise in authoritarianism. Today, we'll be taking a closer look at the Philippines, less than a week before one of the most pivotal elections in the country's history. For the past 6 years, President Rodrigo Duterte has overseen a violent and repressive regime. From his drug war to the failures of his pandemic response, Duterte has sought to suppress and kill political dissidents on the left, fostered corruption among his ranks, and avoided accountability. Like Trumpism, Dutertismo came along on a wave of popular resentment and a bevy of promises to root out corruption. Instead, it more closely mirrors the administration of Ferdinand Marcos, a brutal dictator who ruled the Philippines from 1965 to 1986. Unfortunately, Marcos Duterte is more than a historical analogy. It's also the leading presidential ticket in the upcoming general election next Monday, May 9th. Bongbong Marcos, son of Ferdinand, and Sara Duterte, daughter of Rodrigo, have formed an alliance that promises to mire Philippines politics in the undemocratic legacies of their fathers. At a time when the country is reeling from the pandemic and the subsequent economic fallout, the voices and struggles of the Philippine left are more important than ever. To help us understand how those forces are contending with authoritarianism in the struggle for a democratic future in the Philippines, we're joined by 3 people directly involved in supporting social movements in the Philippines. First, we're joined by Renato Reyes Jr., Secretary General of Bayan Philippines, a nationwide multi-sectoral alliance of grassroots people's organizations fighting for national and social liberation of the Philippines. Renato is an activist and musician based in the Philippines, and he was a founding member of the cultural group Alay Sining and the political party Stand Up. He was also the founding chair of Anak Bayan and former National Security General of League of Filipino Students. We're also joined by Rhonda Ramiro, chair of Bayan USA, a multi-sectoral alliance of over 30 US-based Filipino organizations also fighting for national and social liberation in the Philippines. Rhonda is a longtime part of our CPE community and a member of the International Coordinating Committee of the International League of People's Struggles, the Administrative Committee of the United National Anti-War Coalition, and the Secretariat of the Resist US-led War Movement. Finally, we also have with us Joe Osbaker, a retired trade unionist and a former officer of the Service Employees International Union, SEIU Local 73. Joe is an activist for many years in the peace movement and the lead coordinator of the 15,000-person march on the NATO summit in 2012 in Chicago. He was one of the anti-war and international solidarity activists whose homes were raided by the FBI in 2010. Eventually, that group became the Midwest 23, and they were subpoenaed to a federal grand jury investigating material support to foreign terrorist organizations in Palestine and Colombia. This year, Joe traveled to the Philippines as part of a solidarity mission representing Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. Renato, Rhonda, and Joe, thank you for joining Center for Political Education today. Renato, again, thank you so much for joining us all the way from the Philippines. And let me start with you. We've seen in the past decade a rise in authoritarianism across the globe. And like Trump, Duterte has caused tremendous damage, not only to the lives of those who've been red tagged as communists or terrorists, but to the economic and social welfare of the country as a whole, and to the political climate in the Philippines over the last 6 years. Do you see a possible Bongbong Marcos, Sara Duterte regime as an extension of Rodrigo Duterte's reign of violence and repression, or something else, perhaps something worse even? And what makes that tandem, as you've said, the quote, biggest threat to the democratic aspirations of the people? And what's at stake for working and poor Filipinos in this election?
All right. So, like you said in your question, could it be something worse? Well, most definitely, this tandem that we're seeing, the heirs of the dictators, Marcos and Duterte, really poses a serious threat to the democratic aspirations of the Filipino people. Marcos Jr. is running on a platform where he is telling people the dictatorship of his father, martial law years of his father, were the golden years of Philippine society. So if that's how he views martial law, that's how he views the fascist dictatorship of his dad, then we can fairly say that he will also implement the same fascist trend and outlook from his father. Sara Duterte, meanwhile, ensures a sort of continuity for the Duterte regime. She is also running on a platform of continuing the policies of her father. So we are now faced with a Marcos restoration and a Duterte extension. It is the combination of the worst elements of Philippine politics. Backers of this tandem, uh, these are former presidents who have been the subject of much protests in the past, also a subject of a lot of corruption allegations and human rights violations. So all the really bad elements, the worst of the worst in Philippine politics, have banded together under the Marcos Duterte tandem. That is why there's so much anxiety right now. There's so much concern on what the Philippines will suffer for the next 6 years. 6 years of Duterte was bad enough, but another 6 years of Marcos and Duterte, that will probably be much worse for the Filipino people.
Thanks, Renato. Yep. A quick follow-up. What are some of the most pressing issues before the country in this election that this Marcos Duterte tandem have no answers for, and you're most concerned about worsening conditions for working class and poor Filipinos? What are some of those key issues in this election that have been unaddressed?
Well, the Philippines has been battered by the pandemic, or battered by a very poor pandemic response of the Duterte regime. And because of that, the GDP suffered its all-time low, the greatest decline since World War II. Unemployment was high. We have now the greatest debt, the biggest debt in history, more than 12 trillion pesos. So the economy is one of the major issues of the current elections. What Marcos is doing is saying that the economy could be improved. It could be similar to the golden years. So he goes back to his father. During the time of my dad, it was a dictatorship, or even during martial law, the economy was doing so well. So that's how he's framing his response to the economic crisis. He's promising to bring back a golden era where prices were allegedly low, and then unemployment was low, and the economy was resilient. Of course, all of those were twisted. It's not true. You know, that the martial years of his father showed an improved economy, but that's how he's presenting it.
Before we move on, since you're on the ground, and it's just a week before Election Day, you were mentioning a little bit about the level of anxiety that is permeating the atmosphere in the Philippines right now. Where do things stand in the election, and what do you see as the main task ahead for Bayan and pro-democracy forces to ensure a fair election, and also to prepare for the possibility that the Marcos Duterte campaign claims victory next Monday or next week?
Okay, so surveys are saying Marcos is ahead. Surveys are indicating that he has a huge lead over the nearest rival, the opposition candidate, Lenny Robredo. But what is interesting is that it's a different story on the ground. It's Robredo who has been gathering the biggest crowds, the biggest audience, the biggest rallies, hundreds of thousands of people. So you look at that and you look at the surveys.
Rhonda, do you want to fill in a little bit about what you've been hearing from your conversations with Renato and others on the ground?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we are seeing this momentum building for the opposition candidate. As Renato was saying, over the past few weeks, while the polls are still showing Marcos ahead, the lead in the polls has been reducing, right? So it's starting to erode. And then on the ground, we're seeing massive actions, hundreds of thousands of people. So it's, despite the repression that we've seen, despite the lockdowns, people are going out all over the country, not only in the city center of Manila, but in other parts of the country as well, even in Ilocos, which is Duterte stronghold. So in Baguio, they're coming out into the streets and having these massive rallies for the opposition candidate. So, it gives people some hope that the momentum is shifting. But it's not a time for the movement to let up. And this is what, I think Renato was referring to as far as the anxiety that's in the air, that people know so much hinges on this election. And while, many of the problems of the country had been there for decades and they're going to continue no matter who wins, we do know that a Marcos Duterte win would just exacerbate the situation, because it would be a continuation and probably a intensification of the same policies of the current Duterte presidency, which has mired the country in debt, which has left a trail of bodies of tens of thousands of people who have been slaughtered in the Duterte drug war and in his crackdown on activism. So there's so much at stake, but there is momentum building for the opposition.
And Joe, let's talk. Thank you also for joining, and I want to talk with you, since you were on the ground just a few weeks ago, and having just returned from a visit to Luzon, you wrote about your experience being red tagged and having vinyl posters with your face on it outside of the hotel where you were staying, calling you an ally of terrorists. What is red tagging, and what do you want people in the US left to understand about the political violence that's been taking place in the Philippines? And give us a little bit of your own prognostication and concerns about what's ahead for comrades, activist organizers in the Philippines over the next few weeks and months.
So thank you, Thomas, and Rhonda, for inviting me. So yeah, red tagging is a Filipino version of what went on under McCarthyism in the United States back in the 50s. And it's sometimes red tagging and it's sometimes terror tagging, and I got both. I was the tarpaulins, as I was taught to call them, 5 foot by 4 foot, full color photos and text, accused me of being a ally of a communist terrorist ally. And told me to go back home, that I wasn't wanted there. And it's basically meant to intimidate and to scare people into inactivity. And I saw a couple of examples, and I can talk about one. I see Renato is back. Do you want to try to bring him back in while he's back on, or should I keep talking?
Renato, why don't we just continue on the point you were making before and get back to red tagging, just in terms of what it's like on the ground. I think Rhonda had talked a little bit about the size of the demonstrations and the difference between that and the poll numbers, but give us a little bit of what the current status of things are ahead of a few days before this election.
Yeah, I'll give you an idea, and I'll somehow relate this to the issue of red tagging. So there's a groundswell of support from different sectors. You have artists, you have showbiz personalities, you have students, youth going house to house, convincing people on what's happening. It's phenomenal. We have not seen that kind of energy in the past election. So you can really say that so much is at stake, that people are actually motivated and encouraged to go out and knock on doors and campaign for their candidate. And what's interesting is the government has resorted to red tagging even the vice president. The government has resorted to red tagging the entire opposition. And what's the effect? The people are still going out in the streets. The red tagging has no effect on the opposition, on the supporters. The rallies continue to grow. And I think that's the failure of red tagging. It's not premised on anything concrete. It's just made up of lies and disinformation, and it hasn't really made a dent in the momentum that has been gained by the opposition since March of this year.
And it seems like that means that any Duterte Marcos Duterte victory or alleged victory next week or after next week will also be met with a similar swell of resistance. Is that accurate, or Renato, do you feel like
definitely,
yeah,
most definitely that's where we're at right now. We believe Robredo will win. She has the momentum. She has drawn the biggest crowds. She has the most dedicated campaigners. We're up against a lot of disinformation, but we're going to fight that. And if Robredo loses, it would be because the administration candidates have employed the vilest, dirty tactics of disinformation, harassment, and all sorts of illegal activities such as vote buying. I'm not sure if audiences in the States know of the vote buying in the Philippines. We have no real elections here. Elections are not free in the Philippines. It's the people with money who are buying the votes to get people elected. And that has been the tragic state over so many decades now. So we have sample ballots wherein money is actually stapled on the sample ballots. So they hand this out in secret or sometimes in plain view to people to buy votes. And that's something that we're expecting to happen on Monday. There will be massive vote buying, and any election result that is tainted with vote buying, with disinformation, with harassment, with red tagging, these election results are tainted with fraud, and the people are well within their rights to reject any fraud tainted results. So like what happened in the US, I think there will be protests as soon as the results of election fraud are made public.
Thanks, Renato. That's a good point, maybe, Joe, to get back to what you were talking about of the possible consequences for continued protests, given the current atmosphere of red tagging and given the current practices. And the disinformation and red tagging together is a toxic mix and has been already. So maybe you can get us back into thinking a little bit about what the consequences are, what the political violences look like, and what you anticipate over the next few weeks.
Sure, and I'll try to be dialectical in talking about this. So on the one hand, I had two personal conversations with folks who had been red tagged. One of whom, a young organizer in Tarlac, who back in December was working on a campaign with farmers who, against land grabbing, and one day in the middle of Concepcion, tarpaulins show up with her face, a hammer and sickle on her forehead, and the fear that struck her, and there were about 7 others who were also activists in the neighborhood, and so she had to retreat and spent the next month and a half or so inactive, and the committee of farmers that she had helped to organize had dwindled, and then she said on February 1st she got a Facebook message from another group of farmers who had several hundred hectares of land that should have been theirs stolen from them by the congressman, and they found her on Facebook and said, we need help, and she rushed to they had set up a picket, really an occupation of this land, and she rushed there. And when I got there, the first days of April, talking to this group of farmers, there were about 94 families. I mean, when I was there, there were about, 60 or 70 people. And the people I talked to, they pointed to Pia, the young woman, like her contributions to them. She was the one who said, you need to actually form an organization, elect officers, and then develop plans and they all said, oh my goodness, Pia really helped us, get to this point in our organization. And I can imagine the group of farmers that she was working with in December would have said the same thing about her. And Pia just overcame her fear and just dived back into this new fight. But the red tagging, there it is. That's what it's about. It's about intimidating the organizers and leaving the masses without their skilled leadership. So that was one example. The other one was I met with Ed Cabello, the general secretary of the KMU in the capital region. One of the last nights that I was there when I came back from Tarlac. I had met Ed in 2019. He came here with Mong Palatino. We did a speaking tour to raise awareness, and we sent him to about 7, 8, 9 cities, mostly meeting with trade unionists to build support for the KMU, to raise some money, and to give them those kind of connections with trade union officials. I mean, I know in Milwaukee, they got to meet with the entire Milwaukee Federation of Labor leadership. So I had met Ed. So I went to see him, and he was in a very small room on the 4th floor of a building, nondescript building in an urban poor neighborhood. And they had to sneak me in there because Ed had received death threats, which he believed were credible. And so he wasn't living at home. He wasn't going to the office. He was working, in this little room. He had a desk, a chair, a roll up, a bedroll, and his laptop and his phone. And he was trying to continue his work there. He received a death. So he was red tagged several years ago. He got a death threat in December. But in March, he lives somewhere in the Manila area. I didn't get the exact location. The barangay held a jobs fair in front of his house, showed a video, and had a speaker about communists and their front organizations. And two cops entered his house without knocking, just let themselves in. So at that point, he realized he couldn't stay at home. And I have to tell you, I met Ed once in 2019. I saw him again the second week of April, and I could just see the stress in his face. So yeah, red tagging comes with it, a threat of violence against you, against your loved ones, and he hasn't stopped working, but it's taken a toll on him physically and emotionally, and I think that's what it's for. So yeah, it is repression works, but there's another side of it too, which is, so I'll just tell one more story. So I also got a chance to talk to my friend Tinay Palaybay, and I'm going to just apologize in general for all of my attempts at pronunciations. But Tinay, as folks know, is the head of Karapatan, the human rights watchdog. And for those who've met her, know that Tinay is indomitable. She has such a spirit, and she's got such a fighting outlook. So I asked her about, all of these experiences of repression that I had witnessed, because there were others, but and she said yes, especially in the cities, that the repression, has caused quite a few activists to go underground. But she said one other thing, which is, she said the National Democratic Movement as a whole, she doesn't think has really been affected. And she said, number two, the National Democratic Movement cannot be defeated. And so, I don't know if this is going to get me in any trouble, but she said if they outlaw Karapatan, she said that they would just go underground and put up another organization to do the same work. So, there is repression. It does have a human cost, but those mass rallies that are happening with the with the Lenny Kikos campaign, and the spirit of the movement there, it's dialectical. Repression breeds resistance.
Rhonda, I want to take a step back for a moment for those who might be learning about the struggle for democracy in the Philippines for the first time. Bayan is part of a large set of political forces in the Philippines fighting for national democracy. What's important for all of us in the US and outside of the Philippines to understand about the historical struggle for national democracy in the Philippines, particularly in a moment when authoritarianism is back on the ballot?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Nato and Joe, for everything that you've already said. I think that it's important for people to know that there wouldn't be this repression if there weren't people fighting back. But what are they fighting for in the first place, right? And it's for fundamental change in the system of the Philippines. Before this historic election, started to happen, right? The country already had a character of being semi-colonial and semi-feudal ever since it was granted nominal independence by the US way back 1946. And we know that that system, that condition is not going to change no matter who wins the election. And that this whole electoral arena, right, is still mostly a playground for the ruling class. And so we know that because these conditions of being semi-colonial, semi-feudal are going to persist following the election, we have to continue to struggle for the change. And, what is this national democracy that our movement is fighting for? It's a country that's fully sovereign, independent, and free from imperialism, and right now, principally US imperialism. It means that we're fighting for a government that really represents the genuine interests of the majority and not just the elite. It means a self-reliant economy that provides for the basic needs of the people. The movement is fighting for the full democratic interests of the widest rank of Filipino people. So like the peasants struggle against landlessness in the countryside and against feudal oppression by landlords. 70% of the country is still in the countryside in these kind of feudal or semi-feudal conditions. It's about workers fighting for just wages and having that livable wage. And it's this fight against fascism. And so the National Democratic Movement is, fighting for the full aspirations of what people want and should have, so land to the tillers, an economy that provides jobs for people so we aren't forced out of the country at the rate of 6,000 people every day, and, our families separated around the world. We want a healthcare system that isn't, like the pathetic response that Renato was talking about to the pandemic. It's actually a system that puts people, at the top and over profit. It's about genuine sovereignty for the country so that we don't have foreign ownership of our national industries or what should be our national industries. And we don't have the US military occupying our land and our waters and using our airspace and conducting these military exercises on what should be our land and for the interests of the US instead of the interests of the Filipino people. And so this struggle for national democracy, it's going to continue after the elections. And I think it's important to know that at this critical time, as we are engaging in the electoral process and working with the opposition to defeat Marcos and Duterte, that we're actually engaging the masses in fighting for, reforms that can be possible through the elections, but we're really more importantly, showing them what are the root causes of these problems, what are the real solutions that can be found outside of the elections, and how do we build the people's movement to continue to fight for the change that we want to see. And that's I think the bigger goal even of what's happening right now. We do need to defeat Marcos and Duterte in this election. And we need to continue building this movement for national democracy beyond the election.
Rhonda, and I'll ask this of you and Renato. Joe mentioned that the spirit of the indomitable spirit of the Philippine resistance movement what do you attribute that to in term? And if you were going to talk to other um, people's struggles or people's movements, and especially to the U.S. left, and they asked, what is it about the organization or the character or the practice of the pro-democracy forces, and particularly the resistance in the Philippine left, that has made it such a robust and impossible to defeat movement for so long?
Well, I have two answers. One is historical. The Filipino people have been resisting colonialism more than 300 years of Spanish colonialism. We resisted more than half a century of direct American colonial rule. We continue to resist American neo-colonial rule in the Philippines. We fought Japanese occupation. So we have a very long history of revolutionary struggle um, against colonialism and imperialism, against tyranny, against fascism. 20 years of the Marcos dictatorship, we stood against that. A battalion was formed at the time of the Marcos dictatorship. So we have a long history of struggle, and we draw strength from that. Second, I think the Philippine movement has been able to organize itself. We have unity in terms of line and unity in terms of organization, which enables us to have unity in terms of action. So without a unified line, without unity in organization, we wouldn't last this long, especially given the fascist attacks that we have been subjected to for the last 20 years. It's a testament to the resilience and discipline of the Philippine activists that they remain at the forefront of the struggle despite the tremendous challenges that we have experienced over the previous years.
I want to get back to that idea of the unified line and the other side of that coin in a second. But Rhonda, do you have anything to add to that in terms of what Renato has already said?
Oh, Nato always says things in the most eloquent way. I don't have anything to add, but being an overseas chapter of Bayan, I have to say that the movement also recognizes the need to organize our people in diaspora. And so as you know, over the past 50 years, we've seen this pushing out of more and more people from the Philippines because of the worsening economic conditions, the worsening overall conditions of the country. We have, forced migration. People can't live there. And it creates 10 million people, 10 million Filipinos living overseas, 4 million here in the US. And so seeing our people as still one Filipino people, even as we're living abroad, with that still unified understanding of our political line, the organization, we have unity in action, we're fighting for the same thing, whether we live here in Northern California, or we live in Saudi Arabia, or we live in somewhere in Europe or Australia or Canada. Our people are on pretty much, every continent except for Antarctica, I think, but with the same movement, working for the same thing. Yeah.
Thanks, Rhonda. I want to go back to what you were saying, Renato, about the unity in the Philippine left, and talk a little bit about what it takes to fight authoritarianism, because I think historically fighting authoritarianism, and this is true in the US, particularly in this our latest bout against Trump in the 2020 election, it requires a broad coalition of political forces to work across political differences in a united front. And here in the US, as I mentioned, it was necessary to get Trump out of office, but it also hasn't necessarily borne fruit after that election in terms of getting progressive reforms passed or on the agenda. And in fact, we're still playing significant defense, as witnessed by this recent leak about the upcoming SCOTUS decision on the right to abortion. And so it's not without significant challenges. But I wanted to hear from you, Renato, about some of the successes and the challenges for Bayan in working together in this election and historically with a politically diverse coalition of forces to rally, an electoral campaign against an authoritarian or the threat of an authoritarian presidency?
Well, let me start by saying the building of a broad united front against authoritarianism, against fascism and dictatorship is an absolute necessity if we are to defeat the enemy. Now, the left, the progressives, they may have the most disciplined forces, but they are not the biggest in terms of different political groups. So it is necessary to unite with these diverse class forces and political forces. So you have to deal with the representatives of the ruling class, big business. You have to deal with the representatives of the military establishment. You have to deal with forces who may be anti-Duterte but pro-US in their thinking. You have to deal with groups who are espousing neoliberal economic policy but are sympathetic to the issue of human rights. So we are guided by the principle of unity and struggle. So we may be united on the common platform of opposing Marcos and Duterte, but we have to struggle with them on issues, on fundamental issues, sovereignty. How do we look at the domestic economy? How do we look at the plight of the working people, of the toiling masses? We're not always on the same page with our allies on those issues, especially if the allies come from the ruling elite. Of course, when it comes to red tagging, that's another story. We may be opposed to red tagging, the supporters are opposed to red tagging, but certain sections of the opposition are greatly affected by red tagging, and their response has been to marginalize the left, to avoid further red tagging, which is really the wrong way to go about the problem. You don't stop red tagging by hiding your leftist allies. You stop red tagging by confronting it head on. So these are some of the experiences that we have. I mean, one of our most prominent opposition senatorial candidates, Nery Colmenares, was a shoo-in to be part of the opposition slate, but he was not included because he was from the left, and the campaign feared that he would be more of a liability than an asset. So what did we do? We struggled against that. We criticized that, but at the end of the day, we have to unite on the focus issue, which is to defeat Marcos and Duterte, even if they did not include our candidate, who was a shoo-in and was great support from the wide spectrum of the opposition. So yeah, it's very difficult to navigate, and we are always guided by our class line, our mass line, and what the political objectives, the tactical political objectives are at the current stage.
Thanks, Renato. I really appreciate what you said, particularly about the left being perhaps more disciplined but not as big, and the necessity for this work. Joe, I'm curious, since you've been doing solidarity work for a long time, what you think the context of the Philippines can teach not just the U.S. left but the left in general about these fights against authoritarianism, particularly the difficulties in sort of remaining principled in your struggle, but also being realistic about what's necessary to defeat authoritarianism at any particular moment, and especially within the context of United Front work. I think it's been an ongoing debate in the U.S. left, obviously, in all sorts of areas that where there are accusations often hurled about compromising principle as opposed to developing a unified front. So I'm curious what you think have been some of the lessons you've learned, and what we can learn from the Philippine context.
Well, first, let me just make a general point of agreement with Nato about the importance of a broad united front. So Carper, the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, we were very involved in the fight against, to drive Donald Trump out of office. Nobody, in any progressive movement thought that Joe Biden was worth voting for. This was a hold your nose and vote kind of an election. But one of the things that we've also learned is that not only does the left have discipline and creativity, but the left also has to fight for the united front, and that includes like the example that Nato was giving. On the one hand, okay, don't break with Lenny and Kiko, but on the other hand, they have to be struggled with to understand that and Tina said this to me as well. She said, the National Democratic Movement has its own mass base, and Lenny's slate needs their votes. So you have something to a position of strength to argue from, and that level of organization that that can make the key difference. But I want to talk then about meaningful solidarity. So international solidarity, it means a number of things. It includes like people from other countries coming in, in order to help diminish the violence. Because that's I've been doing that since 1987, and when I traveled to the Nicaragua during the Contra War, with a delegation of students, and so this is one of our tasks as a movement, and I know that what happened to me is I just got harassed. I was a little rattled, but not too bad. But I knew one thing that was in the back of my mind was that they were unlikely to arrest me or harm me, because that would get in the American press. I mean, it might not be on the front page, but it would get some publicity. And they're already suffering, from a PR problem, here in the U.S. As you can see from the relative success that the PHRA has had in getting support in Congress. But I want to say one other thing though. What is not meaningful solidarity? When armchair philosophers on the left, in this country and other imperialist countries, try to tell the Filipinos how to struggle. And I'm just gonna, again, do something probably a little controversial. But a couple of years ago, I wrote a polemic against the editors of Jacobin magazine, because they repeatedly publish these intellectuals who attack the National Democratic Movement. This one intellectual from the Netherlands tries to pretend like there's another mass movement going on in the Philippines that only he knows about. And it's an ongoing struggle for people who are who really want to be in solidarity with the national liberation movements, to struggle with these people to understand that the principal contradiction in the world today is between imperialism and the oppressed nations and peoples. And if you're on the wrong side of that, then you're on the wrong side of the class struggle. That's the most important class struggle happening on earth. So people who try to tell the Filipino movement how to fight or what to think or who they should follow, that is not solidarity.
Thanks, Joe. That was right where I wanted to go next in terms of diving into this question about meaningful solidarity. It's been a question on my mind ever since the beginning of this year, when I spoke to some of our comrades at Haiti Action Committee who also had, were insistent upon making sure that solidarity was meaningful when it was given. Renato and Rhonda, maybe first a reaction to what Joe said about what meaningful solidarity means from the US left. And then I want to drill in a little bit on what it means for Filipinos in the US. But let's maybe start more globally with the US left. What are some of the things that are most meaningful in this current moment, Renato, for people in the U.S. left to do in terms of providing meaningful solidarity?
Yes, we would like our friends and comrades in the States to shine a light on what's happening in the Philippines, to tell your friends, to tell your networks, to tell your allies of the struggle that we are facing. It is very important to us that you actually come visit the Philippines. Joe has been there, has been subjected to a lot of harassment also. Maybe the other visitors might not suffer that same fate. Maybe they will. But what's important is that they're part of the ongoing struggle on the ground in the Philippines. Next, we'd like you to help us address some policy issues. The United States has been giving so much military aid to the Philippines. There's a pending legislation, the Philippine Human Rights Act, wherein we would need some push to get it passed and to stop military aid to fascist regimes such as Duterte's, and eventually, if Marcos wins, then would the U.S. Give military aid to another Marcos? That's another big question. So also, what we would like to ask help from our solidarity allies. So there's so much to do. You can come visit. You can correspond with us. You can take up our issues. You can shine a spotlight on what's going on in the Philippines, and you can help us influence policies that have effects on the Filipino people, policies in the States that have effects on the Filipino people. So hopefully we don't run out of things to do to show our solidarity to the Filipino people's struggle.
Thank you, Renato. Very well said. And Rhonda, maybe you can also pivot a little bit to talking about what meaningful solidarity has meant for US-based Filipinos who are involved in Bayan and beyond.
Sure. Yeah. So maybe a little different framing is that we don't see it as solidarity because we're still part of the same fight, the same struggle. It's we're united in that. But what we do see is building those connections with people here and an understanding of a joint struggle against imperialism and how the movement for national democracy, should it win, right? When we win liberation for our country, that it's actually a victory for all anti-imperialists. Everybody who is trying to strike a blow at US imperialism wins with our victory. And so, we're hoping to build that kind of solidarity, that understanding of shared struggle, shared enemy. We have, and Bayan has the perspective of not just freeing the country and then rebuilding, a system that is the same as before, but really, a socialist perspective on it. And so, that's the other part of like that shared solidarity, a vision for what we actually want, with our country when it's free. But other, in addition to some of the concrete things that Nato was talking about in terms of building solidarity is, we would like to see people out in the streets with us when we are protesting against the horrific policies of the Duterte government, when we are protesting against, millions and millions more US dollars going to the Duterte regime, when we're protesting against a new military agreement or the US military exercises that draw thousands, like literally thousands of troops into the Philippines every year to conduct war games, we'd like our solidarity friends to be in the streets with us protesting against the US government policies toward the Philippines. And so, that is also meaningful solidarity. We do need people in the streets with us, because that's where a lot of the change comes from, right? And we also feel like that can contribute to the building of anti-imperialist movement here. It can contribute to the movement against U.S. militarism globally. You know, it's because we know it's not only the Philippines that's experiencing the influx of money to a repressive regime, or that's experiencing these military agreements that bring in U.S. troops for exercises. You know, we know that we have a shared history with Korea and the people of Okinawa, you know, who have had U.S. bases occupying their land. And so solidarity, you know, means like understanding that our struggles are tied together against a common enemy and for this common vision. So, you know, that's what we're also trying to build.
Thanks, Rhonda. And Joe, what about solidarity work from particular areas of the U.S. left? I think, given your experience in labor, I know you have something to add about U.S. labor support in the Philippines.
Yeah, so I also had an opportunity to meet with another trade unionist. I got a chance to talk with briefly on the last day I was there with Elmer Kabong Labag, who's the head of the KMU nationally in the Philippines, but he's also, you know, running for the Senate. And again, you know, I had met Kabong twice before. I met him in 2016 in Davao at the iChirp conference, and then we brought him to Chicago in 2018 and got the KMU's plaque placed on the official Chicago Federation of Labor monument to the Haymarket Martyrs. Because KMU, what does it stand for? Kilosong Mayo Uno, the May 1st movement. And Chicago is where the 1st of May was born in the 1886 strike for the 8-hour day. Anyway, so I had met him a couple times, and he just impressed upon me again the importance of getting labor solidarity from unions here. And I know that, you know, that there's been a lot of advances. The Communication Workers of America, one of the, you know, most powerful unions in the, you know, among private sector, workers in this country, has been, you know, working together now with the KMU and playing a really helpful role, you know, on a smaller level. So, you know, I was like I said, an officer in SEIU Local 73, public sector workers in Illinois, we were able to, you know, our caucus of rank and file activists in Local 73, which has had, you know, a history of doing support work for the Philippines. We were able to convince our officers in 2018 to, you know, meet with, Filipino labor leaders. They met with Kabong that year. And then the next year when PHRA was initiated, we got Local 73 to endorse it. And then Local 73 was helpful in getting the entire Chicago delegation of Congress people to sign on to PHRA. And then when, Bloody Sunday happened last year, Local 73 again, issued a statement condemning the violence against the trade union movement. So this is important because, while the Democratic Party only recognizes this at election time, organized labor provides the largest number of troops for getting Democrats elected in the country. And so it's, not all Democrats, but some Democrats can be moved, by an appeal from organized labor. So it's important.
Thanks, Joe. It certainly is. And I want to get to some questions we have from our audience, but I have one last question I'd like to just ask of all of you. And I think it's, in part because Renato, you mentioned the long history of struggle against U.S. imperialism and neo-imperialism now in the current moment, neocolonialism in the current moment. The U.S.'s interests are plain to see and have been for some time, but it's not the only state that has strategic interests in the Philippines, and China is also implicated. And so I wanted to talk a little, or get a sense from you a little bit about the degree to which not only China's, but the US's interest and the interplay between those two, how that has been brought to bear on this election and what the implications are for given the possible outcomes of this election on, US and China relations with the Philippines?
That's a great question. The big powers are very much interested in the outcome of the Philippine elections because of its impact on their respective geopolitical interests. China has made some headway in the West Philippine Sea. China has gotten so many advantages under Duterte that they couldn't get in previous regimes. So they would want to see a continuation of Malacanang or Manila's friendliness towards China. Friendliness meaning setting aside our legal victories in the West Philippine Sea, setting aside international law, and begging for China's economic aid. Meanwhile, the US is also keen on blocking whatever advantages China has gained under Duterte. So the US continues to provide military aid to the Philippines just to make sure that the Philippine government would continue to support US interests in the region. What we're looking at is, it's been said that China's candidate is Bongbong Marcos. Bongbong has shown much support and friendliness towards China and its interest in the Philippines. It is also said that the US would probably favor Robredo, and we could see the signals coming from a US State Department report that is critical of Duterte. Then business groups and investment groups have been raising concerns over a Marcos presidency. So just last week, Goldman Sachs said that a Marcos presidency would be a continuation of what we have under Duterte, and a Robredo presidency would be a big shift and an improvement of sorts from the current situation. So yes, they are very much involved. Definitely, there's money being spent for the campaign through their proxies, through their representatives, through the big business interests that are present here in the Philippines from both sides. And what's even worrying is that disinformation being peddled, I think, through China's networks, the troll farms, the sites being hosted offshore in China. These are influencing the mindset of the voters. Disinformation coming from accounts and pages emanating from China. So these are really a great cause of concern for Filipino voters.
Thanks, Renato. Rhonda and Joe, just from the U.S. side of things, in terms of understanding, the increasing antagonism with between the U.S. and China, and particularly from the U.S. side, what else might you add about what your understanding is of the interests of the U.S. and and China, and how that will play out for us in the U.S. left in terms of what we can do and where we should be keeping an eye on, and the potential impacts of foreign policy in the U.S. on the Philippines in the coming days and weeks and months?
So we know that the US wants somebody to win the election who is going to be as friendly as possible to continuing the same US policies when it comes, let's say, when it comes to the military, for example, a country that'll be friendly to a continuation of the visiting forces agreement, of the mutual defense treaty, of the enhanced defense cooperation agreement. These, many military agreements in place that allow the US to be able to essentially base its troops in the Philippines, even though they're not they're legally prohibited from having a physical base located there. They've gotten around it through these different agreements, which allows essentially for the basing of troops using Philippine facilities. It's pretty ridiculous the way they've tried to circumvent the Philippine Constitution. But they've been able to, and it's largely because of friendly government in Malacanang, the equivalent of the White House, right? So that's what they want to see. We know that some of the reasons that we've gotten pushback from Congress people who say they care about human rights in the Philippines, but will not support this Philippine Human Rights Act that is a bill in Congress aimed at cutting US military aid to the Philippines. They've told us point blank that they can't do that because then we don't want to give any opening to China to be able to gain more loyalties from the Philippines. And so in order to keep the Philippines loyal and the Philippine military loyal to US interests, they need to continue to feed the military aid, the funding, and all that support to the Philippine government, especially the military forces there. So, that's at stake. I think, the other part of it is ensuring that the economic policies of the Philippines remain friendly for US interests as well. Right now, the percentage of foreign ownership that is allowed in Philippine corporations, I mean, there could be almost practically 100% foreign ownership of businesses in the Philippines. And so this detracts from the ability of the country to be really independent, right, and sovereign. And so the US would want someone in power who's going to continue those kind of still friendly policies toward business. And then again, labor policies as well. So being able to break down all of the kinds of regulations that protect labor. US wants a free hand to be able to have its businesses be there and exploit labor as severely as it currently does. So that is also at play. But yeah, a big concern for the US government right now is ensuring that the Philippine government elects somebody, has someone in power who is friendly to US policies.
Rhonda, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I agree with the US goal in the elections. I also want to step back for a second and say, what has happened with the NATO-provoked war in Ukraine these last 2 months? I think that the lesson from this, besides how war is terrible, but the U.S. drive towards reasserting its hegemony, on the world stage it's not, oh, will there be a war with China? No, the US is planning and preparing for a war with China. And when they do that, I believe that the Philippines, with or even without permanent bases, the US intends to use the Philippines the same way it was used in Vietnam, as a land-based aircraft carrier. And there will go, so 2 weeks ago, there were 5,000 troops, in exercises on Philippine territory. There could be tens of thousands of troops on Philippine territory. And the Philippine people have a long and bitter experience with US troops. And I think it's going to be very bad for the people of the Philippines, set aside, what the US has in store for China. But I think it's going to be very bad for the Philippines as well. And the anti-war movement here, which at this point is, has been just, this war in Ukraine has just revealed that, this weakness, fundamental underlying weakness in the US anti-war movement, because it's not an anti-imperialist anti-war movement. And the Philippine Solidarity Movement and the Filipinos organization in the US is one of the best sources of education for, I'll just say, at the 2012 march against NATO in Chicago, which was the biggest anti-war demonstration in the country since George Bush left office, George W. Bush. The most militant and well-organized contingent was the Filipino contingent. And also he had some of the best speakers as well. So our movement, our anti-war movement, could learn a lot from your anti-imperialist movement.
Thanks, Joe. And I don't think anyone will ever argue that Filipinos at a march or rally are the most organized and the most militant. That has been my experience throughout my life, and I'm not surprised. I want to start by going to a question from Bashir Raidan, and I apologize if I mispronounced that. With the recent announcement of the endorsement of BBM by the Iglesia Ni Cristo, how important is that development given the institution and its members vote as a bloc, similarly to the evangelical bloc of the United States? Renato, maybe you can take that question.
It's not unexpected. You've seen it coming as early as last year that Bongbong Marcos would get that endorsement, but it's not a guarantee that he will win. There have been cases before that these religious endorsements did not translate into electoral victories for the candidates. So let's just leave that be. Let's continue convincing people, even if they belong to that church. There's no harm in trying to convince them to vote based on their conscience and not based on what their ministers are saying.
Thanks, Renato. And one more question from, I believe it's from Harry Ramambo-Basoa. The question is, do you foresee a long post-electoral crisis after the elections, including use of violence perpetrated against activists who have been red tagged? And maybe Joe, we'll start with you and then we'll go to Renato and Rhonda.
So I'm sorry, let me just look at that question one more time.
It's, do you foresee a long post-electoral crisis after the elections, including use of violence perpetrated against activists who have been red tagged?
I think that if there's a BBM victory, that definitely that there's definitely going to be a continuation of that phenomenon. Again, I was in conversation with Tinay and the other Kasama from Karapatan. They talked about the prospects of of both a Lenny Kiko victory and a BBM Sara Duterte victory, and I'll just say the one sister from the Karapatan actually said that it might be worse for the regime if they allow BBM, for the ruling class, if they allow BBM back into office, because there is such a widespread, mass, a layer of people who who are so opposed to the Marcos family coming back into power. I mean, I'll just say when I was in Tinang, meeting with the farmers that had occupied that 200 hectares of land, we got around to talking about the national elections, and I mean, there was about 15 people in the discussion at that point, and everybody in that group was going to vote for Lenny, but the fear of a BBM victory was clear, and especially two of the older women who were my age, but they had clear memories when they were kids of martial law being imposed. They both told stories when martial law came down in 1972. The one woman said that the military came to her farm and they beat her father so badly he lost his hearing. And the other woman, not quite as traumatic, but said that the military came to her farm and they killed the family dog. But for a kid, that's traumatic. So I think that again, yes, there will be a continuity in the level of repression, but but I also understand that there is a whole layer of people that that's going to generate another wave of struggle as well.
Thanks, Joe. Renato, what do you think about the prospects of a long post-electoral crisis and violence in that period?
Well, immediately, if Marcos wins through cheating, that's going to be a worsening of the political crisis. And the opposition, the people, will reject it, will reject the fraud-tainted victory. There will be no honeymoon for Bongbong Marcos. There will be protests on his first day of office on June 30. And I think he does not have the capacity or the program to solve the economic crisis. So if he can't solve the economic crisis, where will that bring him? That will just deepen the political crisis. It will deepen the resentment among the people, and so the fighting will continue. Can Marcos easily do the same things that his father did? Maybe not. He may try, he might want to, but at the same time, we have to realize people have learned from the harsh lessons of the dictatorship, and they will not allow a repeat of the same. So there are limits to what Marcos can unleash, to what violence he can inflict on the people, because the people will not have it, and the eyes of the world are on the Philippines. So how will their country look if the son of the dictator takes a page out of his father's playbook and inflicts the same kind of violence on the people? The world will certainly condemn it. No? The peoples of the world will certainly condemn that. So yeah, we're bracing for the worst, but we also know that this guy has his own limitations, and he's not as smart as his father. He's not as politically agile as other politicians. So yeah, let's see where that takes us if he becomes president through massive cheating.
Thank you, Renato. We have one more question, and then I'd like to give you all an opportunity to have a last word. It's from Adrian Bonifacio, and it's, what is the significance of Lenny speaking at the May Day rallies in the Philippines? Does it signify a more meaningful openness with the left?
The openness with the left. Wow. I mean, I look at what happened from someone who was there trying to organize it, and it wasn't the easiest thing to organize. In fact, it revealed tensions between the Robredo camp and the labor movement. It's not well. It's encouraging. We can get a sense that she has a heart for working people. At least parts of her program reflect that. But that event itself was a struggle to mount. It wasn't the easiest thing to undertake. So it also gives you a preview into what a Robredo presidency would look like. It has a liberal democratic facade. It can engage it on certain issues, but you may be not on the same page on many fundamental issues, and you would have to struggle and fight hard to get wins for the working people. Yep.
Thanks, Renato. Rhonda, anything to add on that?
I think I could connect it to the previous question too. So when we think about will there be a long, period of political crisis? No matter who wins, this crisis has been there. It's chronic, and it will continue. The form it takes and the form of the struggle between whoever wins the election and the mass movement, it may look a little different, at least at the beginning. So I do think that with a Marcos win, you'll see the no honeymoon and the heated struggle, and definitely the potential for increased violence against the movement and the opposition. But still with a Robredo win, that what we've learned from the past also, and I think in the U.S. we are also learning this lesson, right? Is that you may elect into office the person that you were campaigning for, yet you need to hold them accountable from day one to whatever they campaigned on, their platform. We have some points that we're united on with the Lenny campaign, and we're supporting her election. But if she does win, then she needs to fulfill those campaign promises. And we know it won't just be something that is given easily. It'll still be a fight. It'll still be a struggle. And so there will be that long history of struggle that continues, even if it's not at the level of the kind of crisis that we see happening right now, and the level of repression that we would expect to see with a Marcos win. Yeah.
Rhonda, we're coming up on time, and I want to give you all an opportunity to make a last comment, and then thank you all for your time. At CPE, part of our mission is to help the left sharpen its analysis and then take action. And so my prompt for your last comment is, what is something you want us to pay attention to in the coming weeks? Something that you think we may not be paying attention to now, and what do you want us to do about it? What do you want people who are listening to this program, or who are on the US left, who are capable of engaging in meaningful solidarity, to do about it? So I will start with Joe, then go to Rhonda, and then I will give Renato the last word.
So I don't have a specific event or development. I do know that I agree, of course, with Nato and with Rhonda that whoever gets elected, there's going to be continued crisis. BBM and Duterte get into office, I think there will be a wave of mobilization and anti-imperialist and solidarity forces need to be prepared to mobilize. I will say here in Chicago, one really solid advance that emerged out of economic struggle in 2020. So I just retired from working for 32 years for the state of Illinois. I worked at the University of Illinois, and in the fall of 2020, we had the biggest strike in the university's history. My first, I kind of feel like, always a bridesmaid, never a bride. I had walked many picket lines for strikes. I had never actually been on strike. So, and when we went out on strike, it was 4,000 of my coworkers in Local 73 and 1,000 members of the Illinois Nurses Association. And I knew there were a lot of Filipino nurses at our hospital. I get all my healthcare at our hospital, at the University of Illinois Hospital. But until I saw 1,000 of our nurses in one place, I didn't realize that 40% of the nurses, the members of the nurses union, were Filipino. And the ICHIRP coordinator in Chicago, Narissa Allegretti, also happens to be the NAFCON coordinator, and she was the only Filipino speaker at the opening rally. And so the bond between for me, the solidarity side of my work and the labor side of my work, it was like the circle was closed. And I feel like, and I've also been to at least one of the, Lenny Kiko rallies, which are very significant, couple hundred people at the event I was at. I think, if this is a Marcos Duterte victory, there's going to be big protests. And the movement, the left in this country, needs to be joining in with those, and that includes the labor movement. So yeah, that's what I look forward to.
Thanks, Joe. Rhonda?
Yeah, so I agree that we need people to be in solidarity with our movement, no matter what happens after election day. We don't expect the results immediately, so it could be a number of days. And so join us in the streets. We are actually organizing these vigils for democracy from election day onward. And it's part of our effort to shine a light on the elections, to continue calling for the, honest and clean elections, fair elections, for condemning cheating and fraud that happens in the elections, for condemning the violence and repression that has, been persistent throughout the elections and could intensify on election day and beyond. So, be out there with us in those vigils for democracy, as well as, like Joe was saying, in the beyond the immediate days after the election, because the fight is going to continue, as we know that the crisis will continue. So I think those are the main things I would say for meaningful solidarity in the immediate aftermath of the election, is to be out there on the streets with us. Maybe we'll be celebrating, maybe it'll be condemnation, depending on what the outcome is, but be there on the streets with us.
And Renato, finally.
Well, the comrades have already said everything. Let me just take this opportunity to thank everyone for their continued support and solidarity for the Filipino people's struggle for national and social liberation. We are headed into one of the most pivotal moments in our history, and we hope you could be there with us and support us through this next few days. It's going to be one hell of a ride, and let's hope that we come up on top and with the best interest of the people always on our agenda. Thank you very much. Mabuhay po kayo. Thank you for your solidarity.
Thank you, Renato. Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you, Joe, for your time and for helping me and helping all of us at Center for Political Education and our audience to understand better the struggle of our comrades in the Philippines and how we can provide meaningful solidarity to them. And as people's movements in the Philippines head into this election week and deal with its aftermath, CPE encourages all of us in the US left to stay attentive to the political conditions there and to our government's role in funding and supporting state repression. And I want to thank our captioner, Mary, and to all of you who spent time and stuck with us through this program. In the words of Amilcar Cabral, learn from life, learn from our people, learn from Brooks, learn from the experience of others, and never stop learning. Solidarity to you all in the Philippines, and good night.